certainly have fears that there is a serial killer at loose in Perth.
Sarah Spears, Jane Rimmer, Ciara Glennon.
And every time you saw a young girl walking by, you think, oh God, is she going to be the next victim?
Now, one man stands accused.
If police are right and Edwards is the Claremont serial killer, he's been hiding in plain sight for 20 years.
Today, the trial of the century travelled to China, but not without some technical problems getting there. Natalie Bonjolo and Tim Clarke with you for day 67 of Claremont in Conversation. And Tim, today's evidence really took us to places no one would have expected when this trial first got underway. And I guess if you are a car buff, this would have been fascinating stuff.
Yeah, that's right, Nat. You would have had to have been a car buff, though, to be fascinated. I have to say there are some days in this trial and in court reporting in general that are very dramatic. This probably wasn't one of those days. You would have had to have a pretty niche interest to have it grip you all day. But as we've said before, there are some days that you just need to get through to get to the end point, and that was one of those. But as you say, we did travel to China. And this afternoon we travelled to Victoria, across the Nullarbor, and then right at the late of the day we went right back to cold case detectives. So it was a travel day, and yeah, it was a day that was mostly made up with continuity evidence, but we also did have some very specific detail about fibres and fabrics and makes and models of cars. And I can also now exclusively reveal that I'm an expert in VIN numbers. And so if anyone needs their 17-digit VIN number translated, I can now do it for you.
Well, Damien, if you're listening, Tim now has all of the information that you were asking him yesterday. So what were the issues with the China video link?
Well, I mean, you could probably imagine it's a long way to go, and in the current climate, probably a lot going on in between here and there. So, yeah, for the first sort of 20 or so minutes, there were some sound issues, some technical issues, and in the end, Justice Hall said, look, I'm going to leave the court and let you try and fix it. It didn't take too long to fix, thankfully. So they were all done, and they're not uncommon. They're not uncommon in video links, even to distant parts of Western Australia, let alone distant parts of the planet. But once we got going, the witness was we could hear him loud and clear, and as I say, this was a chap called Craig Porritt, who has worked for General Motors, the derivative, obviously the international derivative of Holden, for many years, and one of his roles at Holden was the interiors, seats, seat covers, fabrics, fabric design, seat belts, and all that type of interior stuff that you probably look at more if you're not a car buff like me than you do the engine. And Mr. Porritt was well across this, as well as being well across the VIN numbers that I made light of, but obviously in this case they're quite important because the VIN number of that car that we discussed yesterday confirmed it was the same car that Mr. Edwards was driving all those years ago. So Mr. Porritt's evidence was twofold. It was one, confirming that VIN number synced up with the style of car it was, this Holden Commodore VS Series 1 station wagon. But then the bulk of it was in terms of the seats and the fabric and the seat covers inside that car, and basically how exclusive those designs and fabrics and polyester stylings were to this particular model.
And so were these seat inserts and the covers and the colours, were they specific to this particular station wagon that we're talking about, the Holden VS Series 1?
Yes, they were. And it was a particular pattern of fabric that part of the questioning went to. I'll try and describe it, but as I said to the listeners, we did manage to secure some pictures from the court yesterday which show this a lot better than I'll be able to describe it. But the front seats, they had bolsters down the side, which were of a plain pattern, and then the inserts in the middle were a more particular coloured pattern with some diagonal crosses on them. And that it's that insert that is going to become important, because it's one of those fibres that was said to have been found on Ciara. Then there's the cabin carpet, and the carpet itself in the front of the car, basically where you place your feet and where the pedals are. That's also important, because fabric from that was allegedly found on both Jane and Ciara. And then there's a different carpet again in the boot of the car, or the station wagon in this case. And that was a different carpet and a different fibre to the front carpet and to the seat insert. And again, that's that fibre, or one of those fibres from that carpet, is said to have been only found in Jane's hair. So Mr. Porritt was questioned quite extensively about the exclusivity, particularly of that insert pattern, and he said that the light grey colouring was only available in that VS Series 1 model, and it was specifically made for Holden, so it was only in that Holden car as well, and an on-sell that they did to Toyota, which was basically the same car but rebadged. So it couldn't have been that a roll of that, or 500 rolls of that particular pattern was sold on and used in other cars, because he said that didn't happen. So, as I say, it wasn't particularly interesting evidence, but I suppose you could say it is important evidence, because someone so senior at Holden saying that fabric could only be found in that car, it narrows it right down to the possibilities of where those fibres could have come from.
Yeah. Well, our producer, Kate Ryan, has sent a couple of questions to Brendan Chapman about this, and she asked him how hard is it to try and prove exactly where a fibre came from. And he's come back to us and said this: it's one thing to say two fibres match, it's another to determine how it got there. Like DNA, we can say DNA at a scene matches a person, but we can't say categorically how it got there. So obviously that's interesting, and we know what the prosecution will say in terms of how it got there.
Yeah, and they're going to stack up the coincidences as well, Matt. I mean, because this isn't just one fibre, because we've got the blue fibres as well. And later on next week, and then after Easter break, we're going to hear about those blue fibres, which could only have come from the Telstra work sorts, so say the prosecution. So then you've got all these different coincidences lined up. The fact that these fibres could have only been found in this car. The fact that there are three different fibres from within the same car, and they're all found to get together on Ciara and Jane. Then you've got the blue fibres that were also found on Ciara and Jane, and found on the victim from the Karrakatta incident in 1995. And the fact that Mr. Edwards not only drove that car in the time period that Jane and Ciara went missing and were murdered, but the fibre was also exclusive to Telstra workwear, and obviously he was a very long-serving Telstra employee. So they will line all those things up and say, well, what are the chances? What are the chances? And we've said that phrase quite a few times as well.
Yeah, that's right. We asked him also a question about the fibre in the car, and said, in this case, that the prosecution is trying to prove that the fibre could only come from the specific make and model. But of course, there would be hundreds of people driving that car around in the 90s. And he said that a fibre from a particular make, model of car is what we call a class characteristic, meaning it can narrow down the scope of donor vehicles, but not individualise like DNA can. It's a bit like blood typing, where we say a B positive narrows down the population, but again, doesn't point to an individual. So, I mean, that's all interesting to weigh up in the evidence that's being brought forward. Was Mr. Porritt asked to look at the pictures of Bradley Edwards' old car that you were shown yesterday?
He was, to confirm that what he said about the pattern, the particular night and pattern that he described. He was asked to look at a picture to say, is that the pattern that you remember? And he confirmed that. And just going briefly back to what Brendan said there, Mr. Porritt was also asked about literally how many cars of this type with this material were in Australia at the time, and he came up with a number of 6,800. That's in Western Australia over that time. But then the prosecutors took him to a string of VIN numbers, about 20 or so, that he was asked to decode, because he was certainly an expert in that as well, and he went through them all. And there was only one of those VIN numbers that they couldn't pinpoint in particular. So again, this was a narrowing down exercise. This was the magnifying glass on the ant, if you see what I mean. The really pinpointing in to say, well, what are the chances of this man with this criminal history, with a fibre that was, exclusive or almost exclusive to him, found on that living victim, then these fibres from this particular type and make and model and year of car being found both on Ciara and Jane.
Yeah, so there are only so many coincidences until they're not a coincidence anymore.
Well, exactly. And that's exactly what the prosecutors are going to say, along with the DNA on Ciara and all that Telstra living witness that we mentioned yesterday, the Telstra, literally the ghost Telstra logo on the car, and everything else that we've heard about, including the emotional upset timeline. That we've talked about a jigsaw a lot, but we are now really getting to the final pieces of this jigsaw being put together. The prosecution hope now whether the defence, when it gets its turn, is going to be able to take a few of those corner pieces off. That's really what we'll have to wait and see.
Yeah. And so you went from Holden cars to outdoor fabric makers. So again, I just found it extraordinary just how far they are going with these witnesses. This was so out of the box as well.
Yeah. So this was the company, or Mr. Antonio Leno was the sales and marketing person that used to work for the company that made the fabric for Holden. So we take it one step further, and Mr. Leno explained that the company called Melba used to make fabrics for every automotive manufacturer in Australia at the time, which was 5. We're sadly down to 5 less than that now, and of course Holden was one of them, and it was Melba, his company, that used to supply the fabrics that went on the seats and on the doors and on the roof and everywhere else in the car, and so he was asked about the development of this particular pattern and colour for Holden, how that was done, how that design was done, and most crucially, I suppose, who it was supplied to. And as I mentioned before, he was specifically asked whether, when this fabric was made and sold, whether there was any leftovers where else that would be sold to, and he said yes, it was sold, but not to another car manufacturer. So the upshot of that is, again, look, this fabric and this particular pattern of fabric and this particular fibre could only be found in this make and model of car at that time in Australia.
And did he talk about what kind of fabric it was? I mean, are we talking about rayon or, polyester or anything like that?
Generally speaking, yes, he did. But we are going to get into the real nuts and bolts of the differences between polyester and polypropylene and rayon and all that type of thing. Probably after Easter now, we got a little mud map from Miss Barbara Gallo right at the end of the day of where we currently sit, and it would appear that the real important chem centre witnesses, they're the ones that are going to literally show the microscopic slides comparing the fibres that were found on the girls to the fibres that were found in this car and on those pants and things. We're going to get to those after the Easter break, so that's where we're headed to. But one step at a time in this very long journey, Nat, and these were a couple of little steps today.
Mr. Jovic, during cross-examination, it was interesting because he asked Antonio about whether the seat insert had grey polyester fibres, and it was interesting because Mr. Antonio sort of didn't really know where he was going with that, did he? No,
that's right, and sometimes prosecution witnesses are very well prepared by the prosecution. They have proofing sessions, and they have their statement that they've already done, and they have pre-trial conferences, so they know roughly where they're going in terms of when the prosecution evidence comes up. But the defence, they can ask them, within reason, pretty much anything, and sometimes a witness, obviously as expert and as in particular subjects as these two guys were today, sometimes they just get completely thrown by a question because maybe they don't understand the reason for it and where it's coming from. I think we would probably understand that line of questioning from Mr. Jovic could be going towards a discrediting of the evidence to come, if you see what I mean. And if the expert doesn't know what's the difference between a polyester and a polypropylene, then what difference does it make? But as we've said all the way along, it's just trying to find a little chink in the armour somewhere that he can use later on when the more central witnesses to this portion of the trial come up.
And the final witness, which I don't think was very long, was Senior Constable Evan, and you'll have to pronounce his last name for me.
Damianopoulos, I think it was. Mm. Yes, so he was a former macro detective or special crime squad detective that did work on macro for a period of time. And again, he was a continuity witness purely to do with the shorts from the Karrakatta rape victim. On a couple of occasions, he was asked to move them from one place to another, and also to separate them out in terms of how they were stored. So the detective explained that when they did a cold case review of the Karrakatta rape in 2018, they were again overseeing and overlooking exactly what exhibits they had and where they were and how they were stored. And at one point, he basically took these shorts out of the packaging that they were in and placed them in another secure envelope individually on their own. And he was asked about how he did that and why he did that. And again, that is basically to tick off someone else that has been physically in touch or close to this pair of shorts, because again, as we've said, there are two fibres that are on there that could become very, very important at the end of the day. And so the prosecution and the defence want to cover all their bases in terms of anyone who's come into contact and would have a possibility of maybe contaminating them.
Yes. We have a quick question before we go from Chris regarding the car. Was there mention, and I haven't heard about this, but you may have, Tim, was there mention of how the seizure affected the innocent owner of the car in Chidlow? Was he compensated for the loss, and was he able to retrieve personal belongings from it, given it that was sealed up and taken away?
Yeah, it is a good question, and we sometimes forget, don't we, the sort of personal impacts that these issues can raise. So the officer that seized the car a couple of days ago, he gave evidence, and he did say that before it was towed away, anything personal belonging to the gentleman who had owned the car for several years, actually. He was allowed to take those items out. Even though actually when we saw some of the photos yesterday, there were a few loose rogue tennis balls in the bottom of that car that I don't think would have been there since 1996. So maybe he didn't see them under a seat, or maybe he just didn't think they were worth keeping. But either way, compensation, I'm not sure. But as a general rule, if you lose something of significant value, and as old as this car was, it was quite an important part of this gentleman's gardening business, because the decal of that business was on the car, so he was obviously using it for work. I think, as a general rule, police will compensate you for any loss. And this car was basically dismantled down to the shell, so I doubt very much whether they would have put it back together again and given it back, given the possible importance to the very, very important case that we're dealing with. So look, I don't know for sure, but I'm pretty sure that police would have compensated him up to a certain point, and the value of that car. And whether he's I know a colleague of mine did actually try and interview him at the time it was taken away, and he said he was absolutely stunned that the car that he'd been driving for about 10 years, as I understand it, was suddenly of such importance to the macro task force. You can only imagine what he might have thought as he saw it driving away on the back of that flatbed truck.
And you imagine, though, at the same time that he would want to assist police in any way possible, given what the circumstances were.
Oh, well, absolutely. I mean, you wouldn't want to be the man that said, no, you can't have the car that could crack open the Claremont case.
That's right. Do you know what's happening in court tomorrow?
Nothing. That we're going to have a day off tomorrow, so they've reached the end of their witnesses for this week. So we come back on Monday, and as I said, Miss Barbagallo did give us a quick mud map of what's to come. So there's a few more continuity witnesses, fabric type witnesses, if I can put it that way, next week. There will also be a lot of statements read in next week. So these are the statements that have been agreed by both parties that are important enough for the judge to hear, but not important enough for the live witness to have to come to court. Then we have the Easter break, so Good Friday and Easter Monday. We won't sit then. And then we have about 10 or 11 witnesses in total left in the prosecution case, and they will include the Chem Centre witnesses, the expert, so that's Dr. Palmer, who comes from the UK, and then we'll be getting towards the end of the prosecution case, which is when we understand that we will finally get to see what Mr. Edwards has had to say after he was arrested in 2016, because his video interview was obviously videotaped, and that will be played in court. And I'm pretty sure the numbers, as much as they can do in the public gallery, might bulk up a little bit, because that will be the first time we'll ever have heard anything publicly uttered by Mr. Edwards about the charges against him.
And they may even have to bring in some extra measures surrounding social distancing, because, as we know, so many people are waiting for that time, and you can imagine hundreds of people potentially turning up at court in the hope of getting a seat to watch that video interview.
Yeah, and I'm sure Justice Hall has thought. I mean, he certainly thought about the climate and the environment that we're in at the moment. Even yesterday, there were slightly stricter measures brought in the district court building. So now it is up to each individual judge who they let into the court for any in-person hearing, be that there's no jury trials going on, but be that a judge alone trial or a sentencing hearing. So if the judge does not want to let people in, that individual judge, they don't have to, and they won't in this current climate. But there's a caveat on that at the bottom of the notice that was posted on the district court building today, to say that public are still allowed in, but it is up to Justice Hall how many and who he allows into the court. So I'm sure he'll have a think about that, because, as I say, I'm pretty sure the public interest will ramp up quite significantly. when that video of the interview is due to be played.
Yes, it'll be very interesting to see how they manage that going forward. So, as Tim mentioned, court won't be sitting tomorrow. That's Friday the 3rd of April, which coincidentally is the date that Ciara Glennon's body was discovered in the northern suburbs. So, Tim, I imagine that is probably a very tough day for the Glennons tomorrow.
You'd absolutely say it would be, even after all these years. That day, as we discussed, went on the bonus episode we did a few weeks ago, on the anniversary of Ciara's disappearance, when we heard Mrs. Glennon, Una Glennon, talking about that day and the things she wrote about that day. There's no possible way that date would ever leave you, and so you can only hope that the Glennons have some peace tomorrow. At least they won't have to worry about what's being said in court, and obviously all our thoughts will be with them, as they pretty much have been every day since this trial began.
That's right, and one of the listeners has very kindly offered to donate Una's book because he's read it and thought someone else might like to read it too, which is lovely. So if you would like to get in touch with us, then we may be able to put you in touch with him. So just email us at clermontpodcast@wanews.com.au. So that's a gift being passed forward from Toby Gibb. So thank you, Toby. We will let you know if anyone would like to borrow the copy of that book and pass it on to someone else. Well, that wraps up week 16 of the trial. We'll be back Monday for day 68 of Claremont in Conversation. Until then, stay safe.
This podcast was produced by Kate Ryan and Alicia Preedy and recorded in the studios of 7 West Media. Audio files were provided from the archives of the 7 Network and the West Australian. Sign up for daily emails and all the latest on the Claremont trial at thewest.com.au.
Enjoying this podcast? If the story behind the headline matters to you, then you can count on thewest.com.au to deliver. For more on Claremont the trial, follow the live blog, watch the nightly news updates, and sign up for daily email updates at thewest.com.au. Subscribe now for just $1 a day at thewest.com.au.